Hey, everybody, and welcome to week 5 as we are looking at the Bible in connection to media, film, and digital and social media. As promised, I wanted to share with you a brief introduction to this week's theme so that as you are watching The Life of Pi and doing the readings and then putting those together in online conversation, you have some idea of the framework that Mark and I had in mind as we put this week together. So the first question is, why media? Media is not exactly a concrete, specific contemporary issue the way that migration or the opioid crisis are contemporary issues, but media is something that is underlying both contemporary issues and our reading and interpretation of the Bible. It makes sense, right? How do we learn about contemporary issues? How do we form and share opinions about them? How do we coordinate in action or advocacy or participation or response to contemporary issues? That is always through some kind of media, be it voice, be it web, be it email, be it in-person presence. So media is a part of all of those contemporary issues. In the same way, the Bible itself is and is grounded in processes of mediation. Well, mediation, what is that? That's a technical term that really talks about how meaning and information are communicated. It's the communication process. The idea that you have a sender of a message or a receiver, and then you have something in the middle that is the message or the meaning that is communicated through something or in some way. And that process is called mediation. When it comes to the Bible, many people who think of the Bible as a sacred text think of it as a mediation from God, right? That's what's behind the idea of the Bible as God's word or the word of God. The idea that the Bible is mediated from God to a certain audience, whoever that is, and that what the Bible is a mediation of God's word, which is interesting because that brings up, of course, a lot of issues about the authority of the Bible, the way in which God is the sender of the message, how that mediation process works. The schools of thought and traditions who talk about the Bible as being inspired and inerrant rest on this idea that, well, the Bible is God's direct, like facts from heaven, every word, exactly what God wanted to convey, and therefore it has to be without error because it's God who's directly sending this pure, undiluted message that we receive in human words, in written form. Another way of looking at that, which is more common to the scholars that we have been in conversation with this quarter in this course, is saying, well, the Bible is a human creation from particular human contexts, in particular human languages, and human mindsets. Now, whether at the end you believe that is inspired by God coming through people, or whether you believe that it's just purely a human creation and that's it, all of those are questions related to the Bible as a mediation. That said, the Bible is also mediated in and into human cultures in a lot of different ways. And probably the best known one is this one, right? So this is a Holy Bible. It is not actually backwards, that's just the camera. But the first thing you might notice if you look at this is to say, what is the Bible? Well, the Bible is a book, as in a book singular. When the reality is that the Bible, what is collected into this book, is more like a library of a multiplicity of books. The Hebrew Bible has 24 books. The Protestant Christian Bible has 66. The Roman Catholic Bible has, I think, 73. And those texts were written by many different authors over more than 1,000 years, coming out of different circumstances and historical and cultural contexts. Yet, when it comes to us in one singular volume, what does that convey? How does this medium shape the message about what the Bible is? It tends to make people think of the Bible as being one unified, coherent narrative, which is why you get tensions around, does the Bible contradict itself or not, as though it's all one thing? Or why you get instances, for example, around the Easter narrative of people taking the 4 accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and sort of dumping them into a Bible blender and turning them into an Easter smoothie, into one story where all of the discrepancies are kind of smoothed out for the sake of having one story. All of that, I think, comes from the idea that the Bible is a book singular. So the medium affects the message. Now, the Bible is not only mediated to us through book form, through many, many translations of the original Hebrew and Greek into all kinds of different languages and different versions of those languages that kind of argue about which one's the truest and most faithful. But the Bible is also mediated in other ways. The Bible's mediated through images, like our discussion last week, whether that's the muscular Jesus on the cross or riding the T-Rex into Jerusalem, or whether it's other kinds of artworks about the people, the characters, the events of the biblical narratives, or whether that's images of the text itself, such as calligraphy and illuminated manuscripts, or what the blog post we read this week calls the Instagram Bible, the taking out of verses and putting them in kind of beautiful flowery writing over photos of sunsets or surrounded by flowers, giving a frame to that particular text that is visual, that gives a certain emphasis to the text and suggests a way in which we should take it. Exhibit A. The inspirational page-a-day calendar with the verse, "If you will just worship me, all will be yours," which makes it sound like something very different than what it is in context, which is the devil tempting Jesus in the wilderness. In addition to visuals like that, the Bible is mediated through film, through television, through stories, through all kinds of different popular ways, including objects, right? Like the things that are for sale at a Christian bookstore, through crosses, through household items, coffee mugs, keychains, t-shirts, jewelry. All of these are mediations of the Bible in different ways, and human beings interact with them in ways that affect and shape what the Bible becomes and how it is understood and received and how it's used and put to work in the culture that's around us. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to focus on media for this week. Now, why, when we're doing that, choose a movie that is like The Life of Pi, right? That is not a Bible movie, that is not a Jesus movie, but that is a mainstream Hollywood, Oscar-nominated and winning popular mainstream film. That does contain references to God and that does contain references to religions, but doesn't claim to be a religious movie, isn't made by any particular religious group. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I believe that in this heavily mediated culture that we're in, surrounded by, swimming in media and in stories all around us, that as studies have shown, the stories we interact with play a large role in shaping us. They shape our identity as individuals and as communities. They shape what we believe about the world, about how time works, how space works, what matters, our ethics. And so, like the Bible, those popular mainstream narratives do something in shaping who we are and how we live and move in the world. And beyond that, things that are made within the North American, U.S. American context are often stamped by Christianity and Judaism in the sense of the scriptures that are the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament, but stamped by Christianity in particular and Protestant Christianity in particular, so that even in a movie that doesn't claim to be religious, there might be an allusion to biblical stories, or there might be characters or things that pop up that you could see in the text. So that's the I See Jesus, right? So in Life of Pi, I wanted us to have a chance to practice some of the methods for this week that look at narrative and culture on a text that is maybe a little less sacred and therefore gives us a little more freedom to work with in analyzing, but also as a way of thinking about how these cultural texts also can function religiously. So that's what we're doing. Now let's just say a couple of words about the methods that we have pulled out for you to read about and then to apply to the movie this week. So Malbin and Bowman both talk about narrative criticism. And as they both say, this is a way to consider the text itself, even recognizing what we said before, that these texts have multiple authors, and in many cases we don't know who the authors are. Even recognizing that they come out of these particular cultural contexts and make all kinds of references to things that are specific to the context, even though they were maybe edited or sewn together over a period of years. All of those questions about the Bible are valuable. Narrative criticism doesn't discount them, but says, at the same time, you can think of what we actually get in the end, the narrative we get, and look at that as a coherent whole. And talk about, what is this story doing? What is this story saying? And as Melvin says, how does the story mean? In other words, how is the story told to accomplish certain goals and to make certain points? And what does that tell us about the perspective of the author and the perspective of the audience that author has in mind, even when we don't know who the actual author or the actual audience are? So one example of that in Melvin is to look at the implied author and implied reader, 32 through 34, and to see there are clues in the narrative that even when we don't know who the author is, can tell us something about the author's perspective or the audience, such as when, in some accounts of the Gospels, the narrator will stop in the middle of describing something Jesus is doing related to Jewish practices and say, oh, and by the way, this is a Jewish practice that was done at this time by Jewish people for these reasons. What does that suggest to us? That the person writing this narration has in mind an audience who doesn't already know these traditions, who needs that explanation, and is therefore probably not a Jewish audience to start with. That's one example of something that can be learned about an implied author or implied audience from the text itself. Another thing that Bowman brings out is that when you look at the different parts of the narration, there's a difference between the narrated discourse and the direct discourse. The narrated discourse is the unseen, omniscient narrator who's kind of telling the story and describing what happens, who's not a character in the story, but is just sort of behind the scenes sharing the story. And then the direct discourse, which is the dialogue, what the people in the biblical stories say to each other, and how both of those kind of tell the story in different ways. These are all really helpful concepts in thinking about films, by the way, too. Since films have many different authors, everybody from the screenwriter to the director to the cinematographer to the costumer to the people who do the set design, and then the editors, sound mixers, all of them are part of who the author is. And yet you can somehow get a perspective on what's the point of view of the film itself, which is like the implied author. And in the same way, through jokes, through cultural references, you can get hints about who's the implied audience for this film. What do they need explained to them? What do they not have explained to them because they're sort of supposed to already know it? Those are things that tend to lead us to implied audience. Now, one of the things Bowman does is take one aspect of a story, right? Let's look at character. Let's look at the character of the people in the book of Judges, and let's look at the character of God. What the character is revealed by how God or the people speak or don't speak, how other people talk about them, and then their actions. And from that, Bowman says, one way to think about the point of Judges, or the theme of the book of Judges, is human purpose in conflict with divine presence. That's one example of how you can answer a question like, what is the point of this text? Or what is the message of this text? And how do you know? And then we come to Gunn, who's doing cultural criticism. One of the things I really like about Gunn's reading is that it points out the difference between older definitions of the word culture that are really thinking about what's called high culture, as opposed to low culture or folk or popular culture, to say everybody has a culture. Now that's important because the same issues of power that are involved in every aspect of human life have also been involved in what's considered high culture. So when you think about, well, what is high culture? Often what comes to mind are going to art museums or to the opera or reading great works of literature. Well, in the US American context, the Western modern context, usually the things that get defined as high culture have been created by and are most easily accessed by European and Euro American white people, middle to upper middle class, more highly educated, more often male. All right, so you see how high culture has been defined as such by and according to the standards of one particular, certain particular identity groups, whereas things that are just dismissed as folk culture or low culture or popular culture also have intersections with race, with gender, with class, with sexuality. And so newer cultural approaches have said, no, this is a problem. And part of exposing those power dynamics and not anymore taking for granted what people with privilege who've defined the terms have taken for granted is to say, how does everyone have a culture? Every person and every community make things, communicate things, share things, things like buildings and products and objects and artwork, but also things like ideas and opinions and beliefs. And so culture takes into consideration how those things are showing up in a text and how they're showing up as part of the furniture in the rooms, like this room, that people are reading and interpreting the Bible in. And so Cultural Guns chapter will look a lot at visual culture and say, what do these images from the book of Judges suggest to us about how people are reading and interpreting Judges? And also on 224, Gunn talks about intertextuality, which I think is a reality, especially in the U.S. context, which has been so shaped by the Bible in so many ways, so that when we come to the actual text, as we've talked about and Mark has said in class, we already have ideas often, images or other ways that we have heard the story or ways that that story has been kind of mediated through culture, so that sometimes we even get surprised by what is in the actual text because we're so much more familiar with the cultural mediations of that text. Think of the birth of Jesus narratives, which have been so shaped by cultural understandings of Christmas that we find out December 25th isn't even in the Bible, and that two of the Gospels, half of the Gospels, don't even talk about the birth of Jesus. And so the way that intertextuality is how our reading of certain text is already shaped by those other cultural texts that are in our lives. So I hope that this gives you a little sense of what we're talking about and why we're approaching the question of media and mediation when it comes to the Bible. The last thing I'll say about these narrative and cultural approaches that is something that's really important to me is that there is this question of whether looking at the Bible in this way, say as a narrative or a literary text, suggests that we are making assumptions about whether the Bible is or isn't, quote unquote, true. As though to look at the Bible as a story suggests that it is already a fiction. I think it's worth problematizing that a little bit in a couple of ways. One, by saying that just by saying something is a narrative isn't necessarily saying that it's completely made up. And some biblical scholars believe it is, and some biblical scholars believe it's not. The other question to ask about that, and I think the Life of Pi raises this question, which is one of the reasons I like it, is the question of what makes a story true. Is it possible to encounter a story even when we know it's fictional and it presents itself as fiction and still find within it deep truths? And if that's true, then what is the difference between fact and truth? Now, please hear me. I am not talking about alternative facts. I am not talking about fake news. I'm not talking about things that kind of purport to be journalistic, objective, empirical, provable fact, but in fact are lies. What I'm talking about is something different. I'm talking about the truth that can be conveyed by story in narrative ways that can contain truth even if not all of the details or all of the story is factual. How is a story true? is the question I want to leave you with as you approach the life of Pi and as you approach these methods and the biblical text this week. I hope you have a wonderful time. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And until we meet again, I'll see you online.